We'll get started. So here we are, and the first part of the PowerPoint was basically, if my keys will work here, was to welcome you. And then the next thing is how the book came to be. And this is our outline for today. I'm going to talk about where the book came from, some major themes, then we'll move on to the chat box, the Epiphany quiz, Q&A, and the drawing, and thank yous. So it's a funny story about this book because it really began, this sounds weird, but it began in high school. And that's when I was faced with the big dilemma of was I going to study history or was I going to study English at university? And my big passion had been history. In fact, I'd been very involved in archaeological digs and even was part of an excavation team for Punic tombs, also did some film work in catacombs. So I was really into archaeology. And what made the difference was a quotation from Aristotle. Now, I didn't go around carrying Aristotle in my pocket, but this particular quotation stayed with me. And that basically he pointed out that history is about things that have happened, historical facts, whereas the world of English and English literature or poetry was about potential, what could happen, what was possible. And that's what made the decision for me to move into the study of English, which then became foundational to my other explorations, because I think I've learnt as much about humanity from literature as I have from from life and meeting people. The whole cast of characters in novels and plays, whether we're talking about a scoundrel like Iago in Othello, or whether we're talking about, some amazing inspirational figure. The whole range of human life can be found walking across the pages of books, or now the internet, you could say. So that was the first thing, I think, my encounter with poetry as what my future was going to be. The other thing was when I was in high school, I was what was called head girl, which meant I was school captain for 2 years. And the mother superior wanted me to come up with a school motto. And so I came up with the idea of seek the truth. And I was sort of proud of the motto. This wasn't done with consultation. It was simply I was asked to come up with a motto. And instead of doing anything collaboratively, I came up with the motto. And then I was told to find a marble plaque and get it put in place and plan the ceremony, etc., etc. And so there was this school motto, which is still on the staircase, the grand staircase of the convent boarding school I attended, and it says, seek the truth. And then shortly after that, I got involved in situational ethics in terms of my personal life, dating against my parents' wishes, being secretive about that, marrying against my parents' wishes. Huge, huge struggle, which landed me in the United States on the Feast of the Epiphany in 1974. Which is when I embarked on a quest for meaning, for truth, for who was I. I arrived in the United States and had to really ask the question, who am I outside my culture, outside my family, where people don't know me either by name or by reputation or by my family's reputation. And it was completely disorienting, spiritually speaking. So I basically embarked on a quest for my own transformation, you might say, my own integration, my own epiphanies. And there were many epiphanies along the way, some of which were helpful and some of which were shattering and some of them comforting, but all in all, they were part of my journey. So the roots then of this go back a long way. It's not a book that I suddenly just decided to write, but rather I think some of the insights I've arrived at have come from my own life experiences going back to my late teens. In terms of what might be useful to everybody here, I've come up with a number of categories of epiphanies, and the most important thing is an epiphany is not just a surprise. It's not just discovering, oh, I've got a new neighbor, or oh, I like the taste of this beverage. It's a moment that can really turn the world upside down. And There are moments which are of divine manifestation, and the story that comes to me is Moses and the burning bush. It could be a moment of discovery. For example, Archimedes' discovery of the theory of buoyancy, which I tell at great length in the book, can be a moment of insight. Siddhartha under the Bodhi tree, reaching a state of new awareness, transcending his previous awareness. A moment of perception, for example, Galileo observing the planets and recognizing that the Earth was not the center of the universe. A moment of intuition, take Chief Seattle's misgivings about what the American government would do with native lands. Or it could be a sudden life-changing encounter with truth, as in the case of Oedipus Rex, where the discovery is not a happy one, but rather it ends up with him discovering that he had inadvertently, married his mother, killed his father, and sired his own siblings. So those are some examples of epiphany moments. And I think they come to play throughout all of life. So whether one's a life coach or a spiritual director or a pastoral counselor or just somebody who meets other people in the course of day-to-day life, those are some of the ways that we experience epiphanies. So in a coaching session, and I'm referring to coaching because that's my main audience, so I think this book is useful for anyone who's trying to see beyond the everyday and the ordinary. The goal of a coaching session or contract is to expand the thinking of the client. But I think epiphany moments go beyond expanding thinking or deepening thinking. It's almost a way of touching the infinite. And so what happens is of such a magnitude that literally the world is shaken, turned upside down, and we are taken beyond our biases, our assumptions, and everything we formerly knew now seems inconsequential, almost not worth knowing or mentioning. So we have this profound revelation, this profound experience of awareness, and there's a physical effect that happens. We experience sense of awe, a sense of speechlessness, you might say. Words become inadequate. There's nothing that we can say that can really sum up the experience we have. And the minute we try to explain what we've experienced, what we have seen, what we have heard, the minute we try to explain, then we rob the experience of its mystery. And so the best thing in some cases is just to stay silent and say nothing at all. Now, there are blocks to unlocking epiphanies, and I go into this in the book quite a bit, and there's probably a chapter on each of these topics. First of all, the main block, I think, is people want to maintain the status quo. Only yesterday, and I was telling Alexia about this, I was having a conversation with the groundskeeper at a parish near here where I live, and we were talking about how the parish could save a lot of money by, instead of using tons of water, gallons of water, I should say, and using pesticides and harming the environment if they moved to a native plant landscape. But his point was that it would be difficult to persuade the parishioners that native plants and grasses were preferable to green lawns. So there was a kind of resistance to the idea of doing something different. So sometimes people cling to what they know to their disadvantage. Take, for example, Blockbuster. Instead of seeing the wave of the future, that creating videos and having people rent them from locations was not the way of the future, but the world of download was going to be the next step. But Blockbuster didn't move with the times. It clung to the status quo, and instead went out of business. Similar thing happened with Kodak, not moving quickly enough away from slide production into digital photography. Faulty recall, very often because of our biases or because we don't pay enough attention. Our assumptions, they can get in the way of having an epiphany. Rigidity of the way we think, we're closed to new ideas. False self-narratives, when we tell ourselves narratives about ourselves that aren't true. For example, I'm not good enough, and that's a really sad one to encounter. And certainly in my work of whether it's been, work as a chaplain at DePaul University or whether it's been through spiritual direction or life coaching, when somebody has this sense of, I can't do it, I'm not good enough, that to me is tragic. When people shortchange themselves and instead of seeing infinite possibility, they see limitation. So these false self-narratives, or I'm too old, I can't do it, or I'm too young, or I don't have the resources, or my health isn't good enough. These are some of the stories we tell ourselves. Another one might be, I'm not good enough to take on this leadership position, or something bad always happens to me. I better not try something new because it's going to be a disaster. Those are blocks. The fear of outcomes. Well, suppose I fail, or suppose I'm successful. And there are people who are terrified of success. I remember having a student once who failed an English class at DePaul. I think it was something like 6 times. And he ended up in my class. And I realized that he was afraid of graduating. So I did something which today would probably get me arrested. And I put him in a classroom and said he was not to leave until he had finished his either missing paper or the exam he had to do. And I made him, I literally did not let him leave until he'd done it, and he passed. And today I'd be arrested for abuse. Whenever this was, it was probably the late 80s when this happened. He was able to graduate, and I hope he had a happy life. Who knows, he might not have done, in which case he will hold a grudge against me forever. Um, Egotism, egotism. Yeah, that's another big one. When our egos are rampant and we think we know everything or we think we deserve everything, we're entitled, we know everything. Nobody is as enlightened as we are. That becomes a real block to any kind of epiphany because it creates a kind of darkness around us that is impenetrable. And so so egotistic thinking or behaviors really get in the way of enlightenment. And then the shadow in all its manifestations. And so the shadow is that repressed part of ourselves, that ignored part of ourselves that can take over and have a menacing kind of aspect. This shadow figure represents everything we have denied or refused to face. And it can pursue us through life until we basically name it and integrate it. And once we integrate it, then the enemy quality of the shadow, in fact, becomes our strength. When we can name our weaknesses, when we can name our fears, when we can look at behaviors which are less than desirable and name them and then move beyond them, then the shadow has been integrated and is no longer a disaster waiting to happen. So those are just some of the blocks to epiphany moments. And then we have some strategies then for dealing with these blocks. And again, I go into each of these in the book. But one of the first ones for unlocking epiphanies is to recognize that there's no such thing as a single truth, the absolute truth, unless you're talking about God. But basically, what is true, I think it was Soren Kierkegaard who said that truth was a synthesis between the objective and the subjective realms. So in other words, you have what is true, and then you have everybody's perspectives that have to be taken into consideration as well. And so let's take a work of literature as an easy example. What does a poem mean? Well, the poem means what the poet intended, but it also means everything that a reader brings to that poem and experiences. So the totality of the poem goes beyond what the poet wrote, but includes the audience and all the readership, not just in this generation, but in generations that have been and generations to come. And so that truth is always expanding. But always fundamentally true in terms of the poet's intent. Identifying the subtext, what is really beneath what this person is saying, whether the person is a friend or a client. What is the person really saying? So, for example, somebody might come to life coaching looking at retirement, and the coach, or it could be spiritual director, notices that the client is not very enthusiastic. Okay, so what's going on? And the client keeps on insisting, well, I don't want a party and I don't want a Rolex watch and I just want it to be over and done with. The reality perhaps is that the client isn't so much dreading the party or the watch, but the client is really afraid of what retirement's going to mean, that the client is going to grieve co-workers, and also miss his or her identity that came with that particular form of employment. Another strategy for unlocking epiphanies is to cross over into the client's experience. What is it like to be the client in that particular client's worldview and experience? So rather than be separate from, what is the client experiencing that I too can do my best to understand and experience so that I am on the same wavelength, even if my experience can never be identical, at least I have an understanding. Imagining alternatives. All right, so this is the situation. These are the options you have. Let's imagine something different. You're locked in a box. There aren't any doors. There aren't any windows. How are you going to get out? Well, perhaps if I rock the box and move it back and forth, I can tip it over, and then perhaps I can crawl out from underneath. But we have to be able to imagine something that hasn't been thought of before. Something which is challenging is identifying our primary addictions. And those of you who've had classes with me know that one of my addictions is the Conference of the Birds. It's a Sufi text which allows us to identify whether we are a nightingale that is addicted to love, or whether we're a hawk addicted to power, or whether we're a finch addicted to fear. And so when we can identify what is our driving addiction, which is usually something very deep-seated, that then we're going forward, we have a way of unblocking the addiction. Just by way of an example, I am a nightingale, and my addiction goes back to infancy. And it goes back to not only the stuffed animals I had and all the friendships that I couldn't let go of, and the drama that would happen if I lost a single doll. But I believe that my addiction began when I was born, when my mother in a military hospital was told never to pick me up if I cried except on the clock. So I was to be fed every 4 hours and picked up every 4 hours, but not to be touched before then or after then. And so I think that my need for affection and for chocolate may have stemmed from my deprivation in infancy. There are many other ways of unlocking epiphanies, being able to identify the whole picture rather than just see a part of it, noticing the details, distinguishing between opposites, the good from the bad, the empty from the full, so we can just make those distinctions. Creativity is a wonderful way of unlocking the unknown, whether it's through art or through music or through journaling or through dance. Whatever way helps us to see beyond the surface and to create and to visualize something different. In coaching, our go-to is always asking powerful questions, and that's always part of coach training. Instead of asking a yes/no question, because as soon as you get into yes/no, you've got a closed mentality. But if you ask an open-ended question, then the client is able to imagine the infinite. And then my specialty, which is working with archetypes. Well, what archetypes are driving us? Are you a healer at the moment? Are you at the moment in the savior mode? Are you at the moment a magician, or are you a wanderer, going through the Himalayas, Lynn, right? So at every stage in our life, we have a multitude of archetypes that are governing us. And when we can help our clients or our friends or our neighbors identify those archetypes, we're helping them move towards some kind of epiphany.